Hello everyone. Welcome to Anime Octopus. Today, we delve into an intriguing scenario in our fanfic series, What If Naruko Kissed Her Sensei? Part 3. Disclaimer: the content on this channel is intended for entertainment and discussion purposes only. I do not own any of the anime footage featured in my videos. All rights and credits belong to their respective creators and copyright holders. Let's begin. The sixth occurrence found Kakashi seated at Ichiraku Ramen, facing two cooling bowls of ramen, one of which he had ordered for his student while awaiting her arrival. An orange-bound volume from the Icha Icha series lay well-worn in his gloved hands, and he sighed wearily into its pages. It was unusual for his student to keep him waiting, yet he reasoned she might have earned a few leniencies, a trait he hoped he had not inadvertently passed on to his team over the years. His irritation manifested as a barely perceptible twitch in his jaw. Tucci's query about heating up his bowls interrupted Kakashi's thoughts. The old man's furrowed brow prompted Kakashi to glance at the clock on the wall. His frown deepened upon realizing his student was 30 minutes late. Nodding in acknowledgement, he struggled to suppress the rising frustration within him. This level of delay was unprecedented for her. He imagined her arriving flustered and apologetic, possibly enveloping him in an embrace that would make it difficult for him to stay irritated. As the bowls were placed before him once more, he chose to forgive her and resumed reading his book. 15 minutes later, Kakashi found himself tapping his foot in mounting anxiety, his composure slipping as the book lay unattended on the bar. His jaw clenched tightly, the ache in his teeth failing to alleviate his growing concern. He attempted to attribute her tardiness to a simple oversight, but he knew she was far too astute and conscientious to forget prior engagements. He wondered if something unforeseen had arisen or if another matter had occupied her time. She valued her relationships too much to neglect informing someone of a change in plans. She was never one to leave others feeling abandoned and always requested a rain check when necessary. Most importantly, she had always kept her word, making her apparent lapse in reliability all the more troubling. The thought of her failing to honor her commitments brought tension to his demeanor. His pale fingers gripped the edge of the bar, the wood yielding to his anxious pressure. Noticing this, he deposited more change than required between the bowls and stormed out of Ichiraku Ramen, barely managing a brief apology before the door flaps fell still in his wake. He marched toward her residence with a determined stride. Upon arriving at her home, he vented his frustration through a series of loud, insistent knocks on her door, propriety lost in his agitation. When the door finally opened, Kakashi was momentarily taken aback. His eyes scanned the interior, noting that she had never been one to leave her home unsecured. The numerous incidents from her youth had ingrained in her the importance of security, and old habits born of fear were not easily forgotten. Kakashi advanced with caution, his spine prickling with an undercurrent of unease. The living room was orderly, its furnishings undisturbed and silent on their pedestals. Her residence had always been sparsely decorated, a reflection of her preference for simplicity over opulence. This minimalist approach had always been beneficial to both of them, providing ample space and sparing him the task of discarding spoiled milk and empty ramen containers. This tranquil reflection was abruptly interrupted as he observed the unnerving stillness of her apartment. The afternoon sun, stagnant on the floor, cast a heavy shadow. Trembling, Kakashi turned the doorknob and entered her room. The bed was neatly made, her clothes were folded, and her plant on the windowsill had been recently watered. Everything seemed in order, save for the slightly ajar door to her master bathroom. Hastily, he entered the room, stumbling over the doorframe and collapsing onto the tile floor. His breath caught in his throat as he finally saw his student. She lay crumpled on the tile, her golden hair splayed around her like fallen petals. Still in her pajamas, adorned with cheerful green frogs, her appearance belied the seriousness of the situation. Her face was contorted in what appeared to be pain, yet she remained unmoving. Kakashi's voice, a desperate whisper, invoked her name as if it were a prayer. As his desperation grew, so did the urgency in his voice. He shook her, pleading for her to awaken, but her blue eyes remained closed. Desperate, he pressed his ear to her chest, praying fervently for the sound of a heartbeat. When a faint knock reached his ears, he awkwardly lifted her into his arms, driven by a surge of anxiety. He glanced briefly at her face, trying to commit to memory the contour of her jawline, the fullness of her lips, and the golden lashes resting against her cheekbones. His breath was sharp and unyielding as he teleported them to the office of a startled Hokage. Upon seeing the figure in his arms, the Hokage placed a steady hand on her goddaughter's forehead. A flash of green enveloped Naruko's skin as the Hokage assessed her vitals, a frown forming on her face. Gently, she lifted Naruko, handling her as though she were fragile porcelain. Kakashi, trembling, passed her over and flinched at the Hokage's commanding orders. She instructed him to wait while she vanished from the room, Naruko carefully cradled in her arms. Without anything to anchor him, Kakashi sank to his knees, overwhelmed by despair. The guilt and anguish threatened to engulf him. He bit his cheek, drawing blood, as he clenched his jaw. He regretted not searching for her sooner. If he had acted on his initial concerns about her unusual lateness, he might have arrived earlier and prevented her current condition. Instead of being alone and vulnerable, she could have been smiling at him, comforting him, and filling him with affection. The weight of his poor judgment sat heavily in his stomach. Soon, the door behind him creaked open, seemingly burdened by Kakashi's emotional weight. Tsunade approached, sensing the anguish emanating from him as if the very walls of his composure were crumbling. She took a moment to acknowledge the gravity of the situation before forcing herself to move forward. "Kakashi," she said softly, kneeling before him and lifting his chin so their eyes met. "Kakashi, you couldn't have known," she comforted as he recoiled from her touch, her hands warm and gentle. He expected her anger, a slap for his perceived failure, and the thought caused a frown to form on his face. Her fingers traced his brow, attempting to ease his tension. "She's in good hands now, she will be okay." She watched as his shoulders relaxed slightly, finding some solace in the fact that Naruko was still alive. "What's wrong with her?" His voice, rough and trembling, broke the silence. He was too afraid to remain calm, his sense of helplessness overwhelming. Perceiving his distress, Tsunade embraced him, striving to offer him comfort and stability. "We don't know," she whispered against his head, her arms tightening around him as if to share her calm with him. "She isn't responding to any of our tests." Kakashi pulled away from her embrace, his eyes wide with horror, making it difficult for her to meet his gaze. "Why not?" he gasped, his voice choked with pain. "Why isn't she responding? How can this be?" Tsunade shook her head, grasping his wrist to lift him to his feet. He wavered, and she steadied him, realizing that he needed to see Naruko to find some measure of peace. "We are currently addressing those concerns, Kakashi," she said as she guided him out of the office. "It seems that Kurama is asleep within her, which prevents us from utilizing her chakra channels for analysis. At this moment, we can only use the Byakugan to ensure everything is functioning correctly. Aside from some minor sluggishness, everything appears to be in order," she continued as they reached the hospital wing, his soft steps the only indication of his presence. "She is resilient, Kakashi," she reminded him as they approached another door. The scent of wildflowers greeted him, causing a pang of pain in his chest. He considered leaving, overwhelmed by the guilt of not having fulfilled his promise to protect her. If he had, she wouldn't be in this situation. His hand steadied him as he opened the door before him. "Whatever this challenge may be," she murmured softly, careful not to disturb the serenity of the room as she moved to Naruko's side, "she will overcome it. She has too much to live for to be held down by this for long." A tender smile appeared as she gently brushed her goddaughter's bangs. "She doesn't belong here," Kakashi sighed, positioning himself on the other side of the bed. He placed his gloved fingers on his student's wrist, counting her pulse. He exhaled in relief when he felt the steady beat against his fingers. His voice was heavy with regret. "I should have known better." Tsunade interrupted with a sharp look, cutting off his self-reproach. "I will hear no more of that, Kakashi," she said firmly, her voice strained. "She does not need your self-pity. What's done is done." Her tone softened as she noticed the trembling in his fingers. "She needs your belief in her, Kakashi. She needs your support." She leaned down to kiss Naruko's forehead, lingering as if to impart her own strength. "She needs you here when she wakes, because she will wake." She gently withdrew from her goddaughter, a brief moment of hesitation clouding her usual grace before she turned toward the door. Her departure was deliberate, as she navigated through the palpable tension in the small confines of the hospital room. She felt she had exhausted all means of comforting him, and no further words could stabilize him. Casting one last look at his trembling form, she observed his lips silently counting her pulse and took a final glance at her goddaughter before exiting the room. A single tear betrayed her composure, which she quickly wiped away. Acknowledging that concern for a loved one was natural, she steeled herself and headed for the hospital laboratories, resolved to scour through old documents in search of a cure. 27 minutes, or 1,485 of Naruko's precious heartbeats, passed before Kakashi emerged from his stupor. He surveyed the room, surprised by Tsunade's absence, and refocused on the hand beneath his fingers. It was more pallid than he remembered, too closely resembling the hospital sheets for his comfort. Her skin lacked the warmth of summer, instead bearing the cold pallor of winter. He drew a shaky breath, as remorse churned within him. The faint echo of her heartbeat in her wrist was insufficient. He traced his fingers up her forearm, pausing at the crook of her elbow to locate another pulse. Relieved by the steady thrum beneath his fingers, he continued to her shoulder. His touch was light, almost ghostly, as if yearning to bridge the distance and sink beneath her skin. His fingers found her neck's arteries, and he held his breath, waiting. As he felt the steady beat, hope intertwined with his lingering regret. He gently caressed her cheek, longing for her to open her eyes and regain the vibrant blush that once adorned her. Perhaps then, she would no longer appear so still and pallid, as if all her vitality had faded to mere ash. He sighed, threading his fingers through her limp bangs, once brilliant gold now dulled, and smoothed them against her unbound hair. He leaned down, pressed his lips to her forehead, and offered a silent prayer for her recovery. This torment was unbearable, he pleaded. The sun that once anchored his world had seemingly set, leaving him in a darkness so profound that even the stars had vanished. If she did not awaken, he feared he would also be consumed by the shadows. He kissed her closed eyes, mourning the loss of their depth, and swallowed his sobs as he reluctantly straightened. With great effort, he tore his gaze from Naruko's still features and scanned the room. He noticed a worn chair, blending into the shadows as if it too mourned the sight before it. Weakly, he dragged it to her side and collapsed into its embrace, his despair overwhelming him. Trembling hands gripped Naruko's as he lost all pretense of composure. 35 minutes later, or 1,925 of Naruko's precious heartbeats, Kakashi bowed his head to the back of her hand and wept. Sleep descended upon Kakashi with a merciful embrace. In his dreams, he wandered through an expanse of such profound blue that it defied description, unpaired by anything he had ever known. He envisioned sunlight casting a gentle glow over every sharp contour, softening it into tranquility. His dreams were filled with serene smiles, gentle laughter, and unfallen stars, with the world revolving around a steadfast point that remained unshaken and unwavering. In this dreamscape, there were no white bedsheets, no healing hands, no losses. Instead, he found himself laughing, tending to mundane tasks, and basking in the presence of a radiant blue and gold entity. In his dreams, he experienced unadulterated joy. However, the fleeting solace of sleep was soon disrupted. A blanket pressed warmly against him, and his gray and red surroundings gave way to the molten amber of Tsunade's eyes. Her concern was evident in the soft glow of starlight that illuminated her face. Gently, she steadied his shoulder to prevent him from rising. "Take it easy," she murmured with a compassionate smile. "I'm here to ensure you're warm. Try to rest more, Kakashi. I will return in a few hours." He nodded in agreement as she cupped his chin. "I know you're frightened," she said softly, her hand brushing through his hair. "I understand the depth of your worry, Kakashi, but," she paused to place a tender kiss on his forehead, "you must also care for yourself. It would be unfortunate for her to recover only to find you in the next room, bedridden." As she withdrew, she noted his astonished expression with a fond smile. She seized the opportunity to offer him affection while he was disoriented, knowing he might have resisted if fully awake. Nevertheless, she believed in the value of love and its role in happiness. With this thought, she gently touched her goddaughter's cheek, the green glow briefly emerging before receding beneath Naruko's skin as it probed Kurama's containment. The stillness of the moment tempted Tsunade to remain by Kakashi's side to monitor Naruko, but she knew this would only obstruct him. Thus, with a final kiss and a whispered farewell, Tsunade vanished into a haze of smoke, leaving Kakashi to his vigilant watch. Kakashi finally released Naruko's hand, wincing as he clenched his fist. He tested the stiffness in his joints, cracking his knuckles until the sensation of being more scarecrow than human began to fade. His eyes drifted over her form, counting the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Even beneath the stark white of the hospital sheets, her steady breathing offered him a glimmer of reassurance, easing the fear that had taken root in his heart. He sighed heavily, raking his hands through his hair as he mulled over the situation that felt undeniably wrong. Leaning back to alleviate the tension that had settled in his muscles, he paid no heed to the discomfort. His gaze repeatedly returned to Naruko, as though compelled by an unseen force to memorize every detail of her stillness. He longed to will her back to consciousness, but such a hope was beyond his reach. Resigned, he closed his eyes and drifted into a dreamless sleep. As morning dawned, the nurses attended to Naruko, checking her vitals, adjusting her pillows, and gently running a cool cloth over her skin. Kakashi left briefly, the oppressive grayness of the room and its occupant driving him to the brink of despair. He only agreed to leave after Tsunade assured him she would remain by Naruko's side until his return. During his short absence, he searched for flowers that captured a mere essence of her scent and quickly returned to her side. Placing the bouquet on the bedside table, he admired the vibrant colors, imagining the smile that would light up her face if she were awake. Such a smile would ease the weight of remorse that burdened his heart, bring him to his knees in gratitude for her continued life, and give him a sense of home, no matter where he was. He missed her with a longing so profound it resonated deep within his soul, leaving a dull ache in its wake. News of Naruko's mysterious ailment spread rapidly throughout Konoha, leaving no one untouched. A palpable heaviness settled over the village, even burdening the youngest children. All festivals were cancelled, preparations were halted, and villagers flocked to the Hokage, offering any assistance they could muster. The lines that wound around homes and encircled the village were met with the same somber response: "There's nothing we can do." Tsunade, though exhausted, was struck by the villagers' unwavering devotion to Naruko. She couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast from years past when they might have sought to harm the child. Now, they offered everything they had, leaving the Hokage's office with tear-streaked faces and hearts heavy with despair. Never before had Konoha witnessed such an outpouring of grief, the very ground seeming to absorb the salt of their tears and the weight of their fallen knees. Few were granted permission to visit Naruko. Though beloved by all and cherished by many, only her closest companions were allowed to see her. Kiba took one look at the pale figure in the bed before storming out, breaking the doorframe in his frustration. Shino, silent as a mountain, made no sound or gesture, nor did he acknowledge Kakashi before quietly exiting. His rigid posture was the only indication of how deeply Naruko's condition affected him. Shikamaru, on the other hand, spoke softly to her, gently running his fingers through her hair and tucking her in with care. He knelt close, his voice barely above a whisper, as if sharing a secret, but Kakashi could hear the plea in his words, the desperate hope. Shikamaru had endured too much loss, and the fear and worry were evident in his subdued tone. Before leaving, he reminded Naruko that he could never serve as her advisor if she did not rise to become Hokage and request his counsel. He shook his head and called her troublesome, a term of endearment reserved for her alone. It became too much for Kakashi when Shikamaru, unable to hold back his tears, finally broke down. The two were like siblings, and Kakashi could feel Shikamaru's anguish as if it were his own. When Shikamaru departed, the sorrow lingered, making it nearly impossible for Kakashi to draw a breath. The following visitors were easier for him to bear. Lee was enthusiastic and hopeful, his words were insistent upon her strength and tenacity. It was refreshing for Kakashi. The barely tolerable spawn of Guy had somehow filled the room with enough hope to survive the endeavor. When he left, Kakashi almost believed him, almost smiled, almost laughed. Neji came afterwards. His eyes strained beneath the Byakugan as he raked them over her form over and over again. Kakashi had to tell him it was futile after 10 minutes of determined surveillance. When Neji relented, there was something akin to breaking in the way he sighed. He did not touch Naruko, but Kakashi could feel the despair that Neji wore like a suit of armor. He was guarded from this hurting by wearing it like a shield, but Kakashi could measure the cost. With a measured pace, Neji left the room, his demeanor heavy with sorrow, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. Tenten, upon crossing the threshold of the door, was overwhelmed with grief, unable to suppress her tears. She took only one step before turning and fleeing, unable to face the heartbreaking sight. Kakashi could not fault her. If he had any sense of self-preservation left, he might have done the same. Ino's arrival took Kakashi by surprise, as she entered the room with the quiet grace of a phantom. He might have missed her presence if it weren't for the soft whisper that escaped her lips, "Oh, Naruko." Those words carried a depth of sorrow that belied her composed exterior. Ino gently placed a peony flower upon Naruko's chest, a symbol of healing, before kissing her cheek and departing. The gesture was simple yet powerful, leaving a deeper mark on Kakashi's already burdened heart. Outside the room, Choji remained steadfast. Though he could not bring himself to enter, he refused to leave, instead ensuring Kakashi was nourished by sending food through a hesitant nurse. A note accompanied the meal, bearing the simple words, "Thank you." The significance was clear to Kakashi. Choji, though unable to confront Naruko's condition directly, acknowledged and appreciated Kakashi's unwavering vigilance over their mutual friend. Kakashi nodded in acknowledgement, understanding that Choji might never see his response, but feeling a sense of closure all the same. Sakura and Sasuke arrived together, their hands intertwined, seeking comfort in each other's presence as they faced the heart-wrenching reality. Kakashi, already burdened with his own grief, turned away, unable to bear the sight. He heard Sakura collapse to her knees, and the subtle sound of displaced sheets as she leaned into Naruko. Sasuke's grip tightened around the bedpost, the entire frame trembling under the force of his emotions. The air around him thickened with unspoken rage, regret, and helplessness. Kakashi could feel the intensity of Sasuke's turmoil, an unresolved tension between him and Naruko that would never find closure if she did not survive. Though Sasuke remained silent, his desperation was palpable, and Kakashi understood that Naruko was more than a comrade to him. She was his equal, his family, and without her, there would be a void that nothing could fill. The depth of Sasuke's anguish threatened to overwhelm Kakashi, already teetering on the edge of his own unraveling. Sakura's sobs eventually turned into strained gasps, each breath a testament to her suffering. When she could no longer bear it, Sasuke half carried, half dragged her from the room, her voice breaking as she repeatedly called out Naruko's name as though it were a mantra. Even after they had left, Kakashi could still hear her anguished pleas echoing in his mind, a haunting reminder of the pain that gripped them all. Hinata was the last to visit that evening, her presence a calming contrast to the turmoil that had preceded her. She quietly brought in a chair, acknowledged Kakashi with a nod, and took Naruko's hand in hers. Then, with a soothing certainty that defied the despair engulfing Konoha, she began to read aloud as though Naruko were merely asleep. Hinata's voice was a balm, her confidence unwavering, as if she alone believed that Naruko would awaken, vibrant as ever, to restore the light to their village. As Kakashi listened, weariness overcame him, and his eyes closed to the peaceful scene before him. Hinata noticed his slumber and was relieved, knowing that in this small way, she had brought him some comfort. Before leaving, she gently kissed Naruko's forehead, offering a silent prayer of gratitude that Kakashi was there to watch over their hero. In her heart, she was certain that true love, whether born of friendship or family, would prevail. Kakashi was jolted awake when Tsunade burst into the room, gasping his name in urgent warning before falling silent, her gaze fixed on the ominous presence that filled the space. Sand began to rise from the cracks in the wooden floor, and Kakashi immediately understood its meaning. With a brief, silent request for Tsunade to stay by Naruko's side, he vanished from the room, ready to confront whatever threat had arrived. He appeared in a clearing behind the hospital. Across the way, a crimson-haired man turned and leveled Kakashi with a glare that would have stopped entire armies in its wake. He hid a shiver as Gaara's anger washed over him as wildfire, singing every ounce of his being with its resentment. It was merciless and all-consuming, and Kakashi did not need words to understand why. All the same, he nodded his head in polite greeting, feigning cordiality if only to prevent Gaara from halting Konoha's restoration by uplifting the entire ground beneath it. Kazekage, Kakashi greeted with measured calm, taking a cautious step forward. It's been a while. How fares Sunagakure? In the blink of an eye, Gaara was before him, his hand delivering a blow that could have shattered bone if intended to kill. Kakashi staggered but remained upright, his body steadying as he swallowed the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. You're faster than ever, Gaara, he remarked with a weary sigh, the nonchalance in his tone betraying the fatigue he felt. Feeling better now? His taunt had the intended effect. Gaara's swirling sand began to settle, some of the tension in his form easing as his anger receded, though Kakashi was acutely aware that one misstep could unravel the fragile truce. He knew Naruko would be far from pleased to learn of any altercation between them upon waking. For her sake, he would endure the pain and engage in this tense dialogue, hoping to guide Gaara to a calmer state before they visited her. Gaara's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening as his gaze locked onto Kakashi's. The sight of his sea-green eyes, sharp as uncut emeralds, brought back memories of Gaara's first visit to Konoha. Those eyes, now searching Kakashi for answers he couldn't provide, seemed to pierce through him. I didn't strike you hard enough, Gaara's voice broke the silence, each word scraping against Kakashi's mind like sandpaper. I should do far worse, he muttered, his tone dropping to a menacing whisper that put Kakashi on edge. His posture shifted, his weight distributing more toward his heels. You made a promise, Gaara seethed, his words barely contained behind gritted teeth. You swore to protect her. His eyes darkened as he took a menacing step forward. Then why? He continued, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried the weight of an earthquake. Why is she lying here if you made such a vow? The clearing fell silent, as though nature itself awaited Kakashi's response. He took a breath, choking on his own words. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice trembling with regret. Gaara, I had no idea. But Gaara's rage exploded before he could finish. The earth beneath them heaved as trees were uprooted with a groan, their splintered remains joining the maelstrom of sand and debris that consumed the clearing. Gaara's fury tore through the air, sharp and relentless. You didn't know? He bellowed, launching himself at Kakashi. That's your excuse? His fist connected with Kakashi's ribs, the crack of bone unmistakable. Is that why she's here? He yelled, a swift kick driving the breath from Kakashi's lungs as he doubled over in pain. You promised. Gaara screamed, his knee crashing against Kakashi's chin, sending his head snapping back. As he fell, Kakashi caught a glimpse of the sky, its blue a bitter reminder that it did not match Naruko's eyes. He made no effort to rise. You promised. Gaara's voice broke, his anger dissipating as his strength left him. The trees, now torn from their roots, crashed to the ground with hollow thuds, mirroring the emptiness within the Kazekage. Sand and stone fell gently around them, as if in a muted apology. Gaara could no longer stand. The weight of his sorrow brought him to his knees, forcing him to sit. He buried his face in his hands, his breath ragged, the words he wanted to say caught in his throat. Kakashi turned his head, feeling the gravel shift beneath his cheek as it mingled with the blood trickling down his face. His weary eyes fell upon the sight of a red-haired man, shoulders trembling in silent grief. Kakashi couldn't fully grasp the depth of Gaara's sorrow over Naruko. She had pulled him from the depths of despair, revived his spirit, and forged a bond despite the blood on his hands. Kakashi knew that Naruko's love for Gaara stemmed from the shared experiences of loss, isolation, and desperation that marked their childhoods. He couldn't blame them for their deep attachment, and though their friendship spanned vast distances, he understood its significance. Naruko had lifted Gaara from the abyss of loneliness and guided him toward love. Gaara embraced that love fully, mended his relationship with his people and, most importantly, with his siblings, ultimately becoming the leader of Sunagakure. The village adored him, and he in turn cherished them. But Kakashi knew it was all for her. Gaara longed to be worthy of Naruko's friendship, needed it, craved it, and pursued it with unwavering determination. When he confessed this to Naruko, She had kissed his cheek, laughed, and assured him that he had already succeeded. The look he gave her was filled with both admiration and astonishment, and she playfully demanded a meal at Ichiraku's as compensation for his earnestness. The memory now felt distant, like a fading light on the horizon, buried with the joy that vanished when Naruko fell silent. Had Kakashi not been so utterly drained, he might have wept alongside Gaara. Recognizing the need to refocus, Kakashi turned his attention to his injuries. He pressed a hand to his side as he struggled to sit up, his breath hitching as pain tore through his body. The sound caught Gaara's attention, and he watched as Kakashi wiped the blood from his face, frowning at the sight of it. Their eyes finally met, and Kakashi's gaze conveyed his dissatisfaction with the devastation around them. He had once cherished this clearing for its solitude, a perfect place for quiet reflection. Now, it lay in ruins, and Kakashi was far from pleased. He had anticipated Gaara's anger but hadn't accounted for its intensity. Gaara's voice broke the silence, a soft baritone that had long since shed the harshness of anger. "Why, Kakashi? Why didn't you defend yourself?" He watched as the silver-haired man shrugged, the usual air of indifference settling over him once again. "I thought I deserved it," Kakashi confessed, his words pulling at the unhealed wounds in his heart. "I let her down, I let you down, someone had to face the consequences." Gaara studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity of his words. The haunted look in Kakashi's eye and the rigid tension in his posture were enough to convince Gaara of his honesty. Rising from his seat, Gaara hesitated only briefly before offering his hand to help Kakashi stand. Kakashi accepted the gesture but was momentarily halted as Gaara placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're a fool," Gaara remarked with a weary grin, though the exhaustion and despair dulled the smile before it reached his eyes. "I know," Kakashi replied, his voice equally fatigued. He observed as Gaara bowed his head, staring at the floor. "I'm sorry," Gaara whispered, his voice laden with sincerity. "I shouldn't have accused you." "I know." His breath caught, the weight of emotion nearly overwhelming him. Kakashi found it painful to listen to the sadness in his voice. "I know you would have helped her if you could. I know she's safe now because of you." Gaara shook his head, as if trying to dispel the sorrow, but when he looked back at Kakashi, his eyes were still clouded with torment. "Thank you," Gaara added, helping Kakashi to his feet. The words were heavy with meaning. "Thank you for protecting her." Though Kakashi stood as still as a statue, it felt as though his heart had shattered. Together, they limped through the dimly lit hospital corridors, their steps burdened by more than just physical exhaustion and the aftermath of battle. They paused before the door to Naruko's room, hesitating before pushing it open to reveal her motionless form. Gaara recoiled as though struck, taking a step back, but Kakashi's hand on his back compelled him forward. Once they were both inside, Kakashi sealed the door behind them, returning to his chair with a heavy heart. Gray and crimson eyes scanned Gaara, ensuring he would stay to pay his respects, though Kakashi found it difficult to focus. His gaze kept drifting back to Naruko, measuring each of her shallow breaths. He imagined her waking up, throwing her arms around Gaara as she always did when he visited Konoha. Kakashi would suppress any jealousy if she would just open her eyes. Gaara remained rooted to his spot, his attention fixed on the sleeping girl. He was aware of Kakashi's gaze shifting between him and Naruko, but he was too consumed by his own agony to care. The absence of her warmth, her voice, her smile, it all weighed heavily on him. This stillness, this coldness, this silence, it wasn't the Naruko he knew, the one he had come to care for so deeply. When his fingers finally moved to touch her hand, he recoiled at the unexpected coldness. She was always warm, almost feverish, a radiant presence that was both blinding and comforting. This chill, this stillness, it wasn't her. This wasn't his Naruko. As Gaara's emerald eyes widened in horror, Kakashi cleared his throat, breaking the oppressive silence. Gaara turned toward him, more forcefully than intended, and had to catch himself. Kakashi's voice was distant, muffled by the haze of Gaara's fear, but the words reached him nonetheless. "Tsunade says she's stable," Kakashi murmured, as if speaking from far away. "She says Naruko will pull through." The assurance lifted some of the fog clouding Gaara's mind. His loneliness and despair had clouded his judgment, made him quick to anger and quicker to sorrow. Hearing that Naruko was stable eased some of the turmoil within him, allowing him to think more clearly. He nodded in understanding and returned his gaze to Naruko. Reaching out to Shukaku in a silent plea, he asked if the Baijuu could reach Kurama. But when Shukaku's usual giggle faltered and ended in frustration, Gaara's shoulders slumped in defeat. His voice emerged hoarse, strained by the weight of unspoken grief and frustration. Even Shukaku cannot reach Kurama. Kakashi's head dipped slightly, the faint glimmer of hope he had clung to dissipating into a hollow void within him. Her chakra channels remain inaccessible, he sighed, his voice laden with fatigue that softened his normally steady cadence. We have only the Byakugan, and although it shows that she's relatively unharmed, it does nothing to reveal what keeps her in this state. Gaara's form sagged as he observed Kakashi, grateful for the man's unwavering vigilance over Naruko, despite the seemingly hopeless situation. The dark circles beneath Kakashi's eyes and the drawn, pallid appearance of his face spoke of sleepless nights that offered no true rest. Understanding the toll this had taken on them both, Gaara chose the only action he knew could offer some relief. He allowed Shukaku to release a gentle wave of chakra, just enough to coax Kakashi into sleep. It happened swiftly, without warning, and required minimal effort. Kakashi managed a startled, irritated glance before his eyelids grew heavy, and he sank deeper into his chair, succumbing to slumber. A wave of relief washed over Gaara as he took his place at the edge of Naruko's bed. With no one to witness his vulnerability, he allowed the anxiety that had been building within him to surface. Mimicking Kakashi's earlier actions, he checked Naruko's pulse, counted her breaths, and gently tucked her further into bed. His fingers, pale and trembling, threaded through her tawny hair, yearning for the spark of life that once brightened his world. He pressed his lips to her cheek, whispering her name with a desperate plea for her to awaken. When she remained motionless, he nestled his face into her neck, releasing the tears he had held back for too long. The loneliness that gripped his heart felt like a suffocating vine of thorns, threatening to crush him. It was as if he had been thrust back to his childhood, abandoned by love, teetering on the brink of despair. He pulled away from her, gasping for breath, choking on her name as he forced down the bile that rose in his throat. And then, as if by some divine intervention, Gaara froze. His tear-streaked eyes caught sight of something he had previously overlooked, a chain, barely visible as it peeked out from the hollow of her collarbone, catching the light as if demanding his attention. With careful hands, he lifted it from beneath her hospital gown, unraveling it from the stone given to her by the Hokage. It was a modest necklace, but one that Gaara recognized instantly. Suspended from the silver chain was the glass charm he had given her years ago, after she had rescued him from the clutches of the Akatsuki. Back then, he had clasped her hand in a gesture of camaraderie, pressing the gift into her palm. He had never imagined she would keep it, let alone wear it close to her heart. He had crafted it himself, painstakingly shaping sand into the kanji for friendship and heating it until the golden grains fused into glass. He had carried it with him, keeping it close, even during the harrowing moment when Shukaku was torn from his body. The pendant had anchored him when his soul drifted in the afterlife, guiding him back to life when she pulled him from the brink. It was his most treasured possession, and giving it to her had been akin to offering his very heart. A gentle warmth spread through Gaara as he allowed the pendant to slip back beneath her collar. To have worn it so close to her heart, to have protected it all these years, she must have felt something akin to his own feelings. Their friendship had endured the trials of time, distance, and the tragedies that life had thrown their way. They had both faced death and returned to one another. This time, he resolved, would be no different. She would open her eyes, smile that radiant smile, and light the world with a new dawn. Shukaku and Kurama would once again share their banter, and the hero of Konoha and the heart of Sunagakure would continue their work to uphold peace across the world. This was not the end of their journey, of that, Gaara was certain. With one last tender kiss to her forehead, he rose from the bed and left Kakashi to his rest. Navigating his way to Tsunade's office, he offered recompense for the damage to the clearing and expressed his gratitude for her care of his friend. Tsunade's knowing smile unsettled him, but she acknowledged his thanks with a nod, wishing him and Suna well. She assured him that she would notify him the moment Naruko regained consciousness. With a respectful bow and a solemn promise to return, Gaara vanished in a swirl of sand and smoke, leaving the Hokage's office filled with the lingering fragrance of desert blossoms. My dear YouTube family, that's all for now. Please subscribe to my channel for more content. Thank you. Gratefully, Anime Octopus.